Prospects for this year were dimmed further by the prediction of just over 1% growth from the Reserve Bank yesterday. But what about the rest of Africa? What does 2017 hold? Well, Deloitte held its annual Africa conference today, titled Africa in 2017, Shaping the Continent's Future. To discuss, we're joined by Martyn Davies from the Emerging Markets in Africa division at Deloitte and Vuyo Ntoi, who's from the African Infrastructure Investment Managers. Thank you, gentlemen. So the focus was all on Africa, but I'm sure that the name of Donald Trump came up.
For instance, it did briefly, and we're talking, I think you've realized it was 2008 and now 2017, and risk is clearly coming from the developed world. Think Brexit, think Donald Trump, arguably. So we touched upon today the potential, clearly Donald Trump is no major free trade proponent. AGOA, for example, we talked about trade trends. South Africa, particularly our automotive sector, has benefited greatly from free trade access into the US market in recent years. And will protectionist sentiment from the US, think Mexico, think other economies like our own, be at risk because of these new Republican sort of Trump-led policies out of the US. It was briefly touched upon.
Well, Vuyo, you focus on infrastructure, but part of that is also attracting foreign direct investment. We want manufacturers to come here. Do you have a comment on the impact of this if he wants to keep them all in the US?
Indeed, having kind of a world that's more closed up would be a bit of a hamper for growth on the continent. I do think, however, that a lot of focus in the conference was given on kind of endogenous, kind of local growth and serving local populations. And I think from an infrastructure perspective, where we have shortages, notwithstanding what's happening from in terms of trade, it was highlighted that it's important to grow infrastructure so that the shortage of supply that currently persists, notwithstanding what's happening with trade, can help lift local populations out of poverty.
Well, where are we? Because for years it's been said that Africa needs infrastructure, especially across borders, to encourage African countries to trade amongst themselves. The AU, it was reported earlier, has a report now on projects to prioritize. But what is actually happening on the ground?
To tell the truth, regional interconnection projects where infrastructure spans over borders have been, there's been a bit of a lull in the development of such projects. One of the projects that is probably the kind of star example of projects of that nature is South Africa's Maputo Corridor, for instance, which spans South Africa and Mozambique and has facilitated a lot of trade between the two countries. There are a number of projects of that nature that are on the cards, but because of their complexity, the number of governments that have to reach agreement for them to get implemented, it has been difficult to get them off the ground.
Who should drive this, Martyn? An opinion? The AU may be coming up with reports, but it has to be country by country adoption, I guess. Is that at least a start?
For instance, a key trend was highlighted today. And we've seen, if we go back to 2005, there was not one IMF bailout country rescue package put in place for sovereigns anywhere in the global economy. Since 2010 to the current, we're having between 10 to 15 IMF bailouts per year, per annum.
Sure.
Increasing many of those are in our own continent. Think Mozambique right now, which defaulted on $60 million sovereign payment last week, negotiating with IMF. Think Angola, think Zambia, think Nigeria, think Ghana, think Kenya. So the IMF interventions across the continent, and I think what Vuyo is saying now, will result in forced structural adjustment. And part of the structural adjustment is the sale, arguably fire sale, selling off of moribund, very poorly managed state-owned enterprises. Think infrastructure here. So I think moving forward, we're hoping that 2016, 2017 growth bottoming out in the continent. We're having a slight uptick in growth, largely driven by an uptick in commodity prices. But the structural adjustment, IMF style, forced upon on very intransigent governments at times, ultimately I'm hoping will lay the foundation for renewed growth by attracting private capital, particularly into the infrastructure sector, think utilities.
Okay, so this is interesting because you're saying it's positive, this external force, and we are not the only ones with problems with state-owned entities.
Undoubtedly, and we're seeing in Mozambique, we're seeing in Ghana, we're seeing Nigeria. I think this is a general trend, and in terms of the economic historical comparison, I likened it to Eastern Europe post-1989, where a political crisis, a political shift resulted in that privatization of industry, allowing of private capital and ultimately long-term growth of those economies. Very similar effect in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, think Korea down to Indonesia, post-1997 Asian financial crisis. So what has that crisis been? A crisis forces change, and unfortunately very few states, governments, are unable to self-reform, self-correct without a crisis, and I think you know who I'm talking about here. So the crisis has come through an oil shock in countries like Nigeria, Angola, etc. In Mozambique's case, it's just a fiscal governance crisis, self-created. But this notion of crisis forcing change is ultimately positive for long-term growth trajectory.
Do you agree?
Certainly, we're seeing a lot of opportunities from a kind of state-owned enterprises getting privatized perspective, particularly in the likes of Ghana, which Martyn just mentioned. I think where there might be a slight challenge is on the regulatory side, where we see governments, for political reasons, for instance, charging tariffs that are below cost in certain government-owned institutions, and regulation will also have to follow the privatization of these assets, i.e. allow these institutions to be cost reflective, make a profit, so that they're sustainable.
I was looking at the blurb. You say a new Africa is emerging, one that is no longer propelled by inflated oil and commodity prices. Is that all true? Because look how Nigeria was affected when commodity prices did come down. We are so happy that metals are going to go up this year. Is Africa still just so reliant?
In most cases, that's the case, Francis, particularly for oil-propelled economies, what I call hand-to-mouth economies. So living on a roller coaster, and the growth trajectory resembles a roller coaster depending entirely on the commodity price at that particular time. And West Africa is predominantly that story. In the East Africa context, which is, again, oil and solid commodity poor, you're seeing very robust growth. Think Kenya, think Tanzania, think Ethiopia, Rwanda, etc. I think where I'm getting at in terms of where you're getting at in terms of those comments is Ethiopia, for example, or Rwanda, countries that are relatively very resource poor, solid commodity poor, oil poor, but countries that have very robust, strong growth rates. How are they doing that? In Ethiopia's case, it's through fiscal policy, i.e. high investment rate to GDP, over 35%, which is, in South Africa's case, we're about 19, 20. So very high investment into capex, into economic enabling infrastructure. We're seeing that. In Rwanda's case, it's about liberalization. And Rwanda is effectively an open house for capital in a very, relatively speaking, closed neighborhood. So it's how do states actively liberalize or use arguably fiscal policy in a counter-cyclical fashion, thinking commodities here, to grow their economies. That's innovative, agile growth. It's up to, and I use that phrase again, structural reform. It's up to the traditionally commodity-driven economies to make that adjustment. But it's not a switch. It's a generational play. And the Asian economic example in the last generation or so, 20, 30 years, is evidence of that.
Well, I love what I believe is happening in East Africa, which is a lot of opening of borders, openness to skills moving. Are you seeing anything different in East Africa with infrastructure? Does it help?
Well, I mean, countries like Rwanda obviously poster children for kind of a integrated plan for how to develop the economy. So it's
and is
all
it going across the region?
Yeah, it's human resources, it's access, it's borders, and as a result of Rwanda being that shining light in the region, I think a lot of the countries around it are also picking up on Rwanda's trajectory, like Ethiopia, for instance. And I mean, we've got a couple of countries in West Africa as well, the likes of Gabon, who've also counter-cyclically invested in infrastructure using some of the the cash that they raised during the oil boom. So it's not necessarily all concentrated in East Africa. Cameroon and Gabon are countries in West Africa that are also exhibiting similar characteristics. So it is possible to be an oil economy but get yourself through the bottom through counter-cyclical
use it
fiscal
for
policy.
good investments for the future. Who are your shining lights, the African countries to watch this year, and why?
I think there's different stories for different countries. I think ultimately the liberalization post-resources economy example is not a mainland African continental country, but Mauritius, and we'll claim it as part of a continent. So post-resources, i.e. post-sugar. Mauritius really is that sort of that shining example. Rwanda, from an enabling state perspective, the state is entrepreneurial. The state enables business and it actively liberalizes its sectors, which traditionally private capital is not allowed to play in many other regional countries. Ethiopia, from a fiscal policy spend, infrastructure-driven growth, ultimately economic enabling infrastructure. From a governance perspective, the highest rated sovereign in the continent by rating agencies, Botswana. It's long-term sort of stability as you go approach. From an interesting West Africa perspective, Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. Strong, robust growth, liberalization, reform, low base effect, post-conflict economy. Morocco, diversification, industry, particularly from Europe, accessing the EU market. There's many examples like that, but unfortunately, for every success case I highlight, there's failed states as well. Think DRC, think many others, and most of the problems are self-caused and they're political.
And rising political risk, I was going to say. Okay, we're running out of time, so a quick comment from both of you. Africa was the forgotten continent, then the exciting growth prospect, you know, with these young people rising up, but then the financial crisis came. We were on the back burner again. Just your overall impression of the prospects, and I know we can't lump everybody together, but the prospects for Africa this year, starting with you, Martyn.
Francis, I think it's a year of correction still, 2016, 2017. I think we've hit the bottoming out. We need to structurally reform to regain our mojo. And again, some countries will emerge as aspirational, truly emerging frontier, emerging market economies. And some, I'm afraid, will just reinforce the perception that they're failed states. That's 2017 for me.
For you?
I think continentally, the Africa Rising story was about kind of 1 billion consumers on the continent and the potential to make returns from them. I think you still have 1 billion consumers on the continent. So from a prospects perspective, I think, yes, we've had the lull in 2016, but I think 2017 is going to be the turning of the tide and still an opportunity for investors like ourselves to take advantage of the opportunity that the continent gives.
I hope you are right. Thank you both for your analysis. Martyn Davies from Deloitte Africa, Vuyo Ntoi from African Infrastructure Investment Managers.